Happy Halloween, boys and ghouls. Welcome back. I am D, your ever humble host and fearless guide through the winding wilderness of cinema history. This is it, folks. Our journey through horror has brought us all the way up to the 2010s, the decade that ended less than a year ago. I struggled for quite a while with making a top 10 list for this decade, coming up with new titles to include and others to dismiss, and eventually I decided to go a different route. So this is gonna be a top 20 list instead, and I'll make the presentations shorter and simpler because, let's face it, it's Halloween and y'all got better things to do than listening to me prattling on anyway. So, starting from number 20, let's get this thing going. Victor Frankenstein is yet another version of Mary Shelley's book, this time done as a counter-narrative, telling the story from the assistant's point of view. The strengths of this is the acting, with the interaction between James McAvoy's Doctor and Daniel Radcliffe's Igor being the highlight. I placed this low on the list because it's definitely a flawed movie, a lot of the problems bearing the telltale fingerprints of studio meddling. Still, it entertained me. The Visit is an unlikely win. The combination of found footage and M. Night Shyamalan should be warning signs enough, but it actually works. It's a story about a couple of kids staying at their grandparents' house while the elders start acting increasingly strange. With a couple of creepy scenes and some decent enough ideas, it deserves at least a place on the list. The Ward. John Carpenter seldomly disappoints you, and even if this one's not among his strongest films, it's still a worthwhile movie. It follows an institutionalized young woman possibly haunted by a malevolent spirit and explores claustrophobic environments and dangerous delusions, enough to captivate you for an hour and a half. Sinister is a grim and grainy nightmare of a movie where a crime writer investigates a series of old murders only to find a dark entity lurking behind them. With some memorable scenes and effective scares, this is one that might well pop back up in your dreams. Midsommar. This one was a big talkie last year. While I can recognize it as a well-crafted movie, I find it exceedingly hard to take seriously. Being that it's set in Sweden, me a Swede myself, I can't really help but laugh at some of the bizarre cultural depictions. As I said though, a well-crafted movie, and if you like it, I can clearly see why. Bone Tomahawk might not actually be a horror film, but it has at least a couple of scenes that are gruesome enough to maybe make it qualify. It's set in the Old West and follows a mission to rescue people abducted by mysterious cannibals. It's an iffy subject perhaps, but the movie toes the line. Also, Sid Haig's in it, so that alone makes it worth your time. The 2010 Wolfman remake was released to a resounding meh, and has since then mostly been gathering dust, but it's honestly better than many give it credit for. It harkens back to the aesthetics of the Hammer Studios' glory days of the late 50s and early 60s, and it does it rather well. It's not a perfect film, far from it, but I find it artistically pleasing and quite deserving of a mention. Don't Breathe, on the other hand, received quite a buzz on its release. It follows a group of young burglars who break into the house of an elderly blind man, thinking it's an easy hit, only to find they bit off a whole lot more than they can chew. One interesting aspect here is the lack of good and bad. Basically everyone sucks, and while the victimized old man turns out to be a monster in his own right, he's more misguided than evil. It's grim and cynical, but a damn good movie. The remake of Stephen King's It landed with quite a splash. While not everyone enjoyed it, it's not often that you see a horror movie make such a cultural impact these days. Myself, I think I enjoy this even more than the old Tim Curry version, which I honestly didn't expect. Wasn't quite as impressed by the second film though, but this one sure took me by surprise. Hereditary. Now this was a strange one. It's an eerie movie about loss and grief at first and gradually turns into a supernatural fever dream. Most notably, it doesn't shy away from tough subjects and is relentless in how it handles some things that would have been taboo in Western cinema not long ago. Especially a certain decapitation scene. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm referring to, and if you haven't seen it, I say you should. Insidious was the point where I myself noticed the horror landscape evolving. It's dark but playful and takes an unexpected twist on the possessed child trope. Also, it's not afraid to do some original lore building of a style and scale that we hadn't really seen since the 80s. If you're a fan of something like the Stranger Things TV series, know that that one has a lot to thank Insidious for. The Babadook was written and directed by Australian filmmaker Jennifer Kent. It's an odd nightmarish tale of depression and paranoia personified by the shadowy figure of the Babadook that gradually takes over the characters' lives. I didn't like this movie the first time I watched it, but it's grown on me a lot since then. And I must admit, the Babadook himself is one of the coolest original horror characters of the decade. Happy Death Day is a horror comedy that plays like a bloodier version of Groundhog Day, where a college student is forced to relive the day of her murder over and over, trying to break the cycle and hopefully become less of a horrible person along the way. It's a playfully self-aware movie with a neat retro slasher vibe to it. It's time loop comedy done right, and a damn good movie at that. Split is another surprisingly strong movie by filmmaker M. Night Shyamalan. It follows three girls attempting to escape from a dangerous man with a severe case of split personality disorder. This is easily Shyamalan's strongest piece since Sixth Sense, and it's quite remarkable to spring back from a 17-year quality dip. It shows that while his hits are few and far between, he packs one hell of a punch when he lands them. Hellfest is a great callback to the 80s slasher era, updated for modern times but without skimping on its heritage. The movie takes place at a horror-themed amusement park where a masked killer moves unseen in the crowd. Aesthetically, I found this movie very pleasing. It does a fine job to convey the feelings of dread and imminent danger that were the selling points of the genre back in the day. This movie appears to have flown below the radar for most people, and I sure hope that more get to experience it in all its campy goodness. Oculus is another one that I believe many missed. It's a simple but well-made movie about two siblings and their fight against a haunted mirror, or rather, quite potentially against their own troubled psyches. Oculus excels at creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and apprehension, where you're never sure if what you see is real or only in the characters' heads. Also, there's a couple of scenes that I bet you are gonna stick with you. Anyway, something to reflect on. Cabin in the Woods. Self-awareness was a big thing in horror in this decade, and there are few movies that are as self-aware as this one. The premise is deceptively traditional, with a group of young people staying in a secluded forest cottage, but it soon turns on its heels and spirals off into absolute glorious chaos. More than anything, Cabin in the Woods offers cynical yet playful commentary on horror cliches and expectations, a bit like Scream did in the 90s. Worth mentioning is that Scream actually had a sequel the same year as this one that turned out a lot less impressive. It is perhaps telling that while Scream 4 failed to address the state of the genre, The Cabin in the Woods nailed it. Before we move on to the top 3, let me clarify that the order of the entries on this list is not exactly set in stone. I kept moving them around up until the time of recording, and I'm sure I won't be satisfied in hindsight either. Also, I know that there are movies that I haven't seen yet for one reason or another, and certainly one or two that I've forgotten about that might have deserved a spot. It's difficult to make accurate lists about things this recent, to be honest. What I was quite certain of, however, was the top 3. So, once more onto the breach, the top 3 horror movies of the 2010s. Colorado Space is a loose adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story of the same name. The movie takes place on a farm where a meteor lands, bringing with it something amorphous and alien that infects the farm, slowly driving everyone there mad. For once, it actually makes sense to see Nicolas Cage in one of the lead roles, as insane seems to be by far his preferred acting method of late. The color out of space is bright and dazzling and quite unlike anything seen on this earth. Train to Busan is a Korean zombie movie that differentiates itself from the rest of the extensive zombie library of the decade by actually being really good. The movie is set on a train during a zombie outbreak, where the transport quickly becomes its own isolated society, with the different cars and compartments artistically used as metaphorical class divides and social borders. A sequel hit the tracks only a couple of months ago. I haven't seen it yet, but judging from the lack of buzz around it, I'm not feeling too hopeful. Still, the original is an absolute gem and one that I'll happily buy a return ticket for. The Conjuring. A bit predictable maybe, but this is my list. The Conjuring is based on the real-life stories of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, famously proven to be frauds, but don't let that detract from a good story. The movie takes place on a haunted farm in the early 70s, where said paranormalists have to help save the residents from the demonic menace. The Conjuring was greatly successful and spawned a number of sequels and spin-offs, turning into what's probably the largest horror universe of the millennium so far. But honestly, most films in there are not really that impressive. The original is a damn good flick though, quite possibly the best horror movie of the 2010s. And that concludes my journey through horror movie history. I hope I've given you some food for thought and maybe inspired you to watch a scary flick or two this October. If you enjoyed my work, consider subscribing. The journey may be done, but this will not be the last you hear from me. Thanks for tagging along. Happy Halloween. Catch you on the flip side.